When Saddam Hussein seized the presidency, he promised strength and unity for Iraq. But behind the image he showed to the world was a regime built on fear. Women were silenced through brutality, families shattered by executions, and entire communities lived in terror. What began as a vision of power became a nightmare that scarred generations. Saddam was born in 1937 in the village of Al-Auja, near Tikrit. His father died before he was born, and his mother struggled to raise him. From a young age, Saddam grew up in an environment filled with violence and revenge. By the late 1950s, he joined the Ba'ath Party, a political movement that promised Arab unity, but relied heavily on fear and assassination. Saddam quickly made a name for himself as someone ruthless, willing to kill for power. When the Ba'ath Party took control of Iraq in 1968, Saddam was already a key figure. Though Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr was officially president, Saddam was the one pulling the strings in the background. He used intelligence networks, prisons, and militias to crush his opponents. By 1979, Saddam forced al-Bakr to resign and became president himself. From that moment, his absolute control began. He wanted Iraq to look strong, modern, and respected by the world. He gave speeches about progress, built large government buildings, and tried to show that Iraq was becoming a modern Arab country. Universities expanded, and more women were encouraged to study medicine, engineering, and teaching. Some women even joined the workforce in government jobs, which made it look like Saddam was giving females new opportunities. But the truth was very different once you looked past the surface. All of this progress was tightly controlled by Saddam's rule. Women who worked in offices, schools, or hospitals knew that they were always being watched. The Mukhabarat, Saddam's feared secret police, had eyes everywhere. They could show up at homes without warning, asking questions or taking someone away. Many families lived in fear that a husband, a father, or even a son could be arrested in the middle of the night and never return. This left women carrying heavy burdens. A wife could suddenly find herself without a husband, forced to provide for her children alone. Sisters had to raise their younger siblings because their brothers had been taken. Mothers were left to beg for news about their sons who vanished into prisons. No one dared to ask too many questions, because even showing concern could be seen as disloyalty to Saddam's government. But the nightmare had just started. In September 1980, Saddam Hussein launched a surprise attack on Iran. He thought the war would be quick, maybe just a few months, and that Iraq would easily win. But he was wrong. The war dragged on for 8 long years, becoming one of the bloodiest conflicts of the 20th century. Cities were bombed, entire villages destroyed, and young men were sent to the front lines in endless waves. For Iraq's women, this war was a daily nightmare. With so many men gone, they had to take on roles they had never imagined. Mothers became providers, raising children alone while also trying to earn money for food. Teenage girls were forced to leave school early to work in shops, markets, or farms. Widows filled every neighborhood, wearing black as a constant reminder of loss. The sound of funerals and the wailing of grieving mothers became part of everyday life. But their struggles did not stop there. The war gave Saddam's regime new excuses to tighten its grip. Anyone who questioned the war or complained about the suffering was labeled a traitor. Women whose husbands were accused of disloyalty often paid the price themselves. Some were dragged to detention centers, beaten, and humiliated. Others were raped by guards or soldiers as punishment. Many of these women never came back, leaving children to grow up as orphans without ever knowing the truth of what happened to their mothers. Even outside the prisons, fear was constant. Saddam's intelligence services spread across the country, keeping close watch on families. If a woman received a letter from a relative abroad or spoke critically of the government, she risked arrest. Entire households could be destroyed by just one suspicion. And while propaganda posters showed strong Iraqi women working in factories or nursing the wounded, the reality was far more painful. By the time the war ended in 1988, more than 500,000 people from both sides had been killed, and millions more were wounded or displaced. Iraq was drained of money, hope, and life. Roads, schools, and hospitals were in ruins. Families were shattered. Women carried the heaviest scars, both visible and hidden. And yet instead of peace, they would soon face even darker years ahead, because Saddam was not finished. By the late 1980s, Saddam's attention turned toward the Kurdish people in northern Iraq. The Kurds had long dreamed of independence, and during the Iran-Iraq War, some Kurdish people sided with Iran, hoping it would bring them closer to freedom. For Saddam, this was unforgivable. He saw the Kurds not as fellow Iraqis, but as enemies inside his borders. In 1987, he launched a campaign called Anfal. It was led by his cousin, Ali Hassan al-Majid, who became infamous as Chemical Ali. The campaign was not just about fighting rebels. It was about wiping out Kurdish life in whole regions. Villages were bulldozed, farmland was burned, and families were rounded up in mass sweeps. Over 100,000 Kurds were killed, and entire communities vanished from the map. Kurdish women suffered the most. When villages were attacked, men were often executed on the spot, while women and children were separated. Many women were forced onto trucks and taken away to prisons or detention camps. Some were executed in groups, their bodies left in mass graves. Others faced sexual violence at the hands of soldiers. Teenage girls, some as young as 12, disappeared into military compounds and were never seen again. Their families never learned what happened to them. For those who survived, life inside the camps was cruel. Women were stripped of dignity, humiliated, and made to live in filthy conditions with little food or water. Mothers tried to protect their children, but many watched them starve or die from sickness. Stories later emerged of women being beaten if they cried for their lost relatives, as if grief itself was a crime. The world remembers Halabja, the Kurdish town bombed with poison gas in March 1988. Around 5,000 civilians were killed in a single day, their bodies lying in the streets. But behind that headline were thousands of other Kurdish women whose pain was quieter, but just as devastating. Some lost entire families in one sweep. Others were forced to remarry against their will after being displaced. Many carried the trauma for the rest of their lives, unable to speak of what was done to them. In August 1990, Saddam again made a bold move that shocked the world. He sent his army into Kuwait and took control of the small oil-rich country. This act immediately drew global attention. The United States and its allies saw it as a threat to the balance of power in the Middle East. Within months, a massive international coalition formed to drive Saddam out. By January 1991, the Gulf War began. For weeks, coalition forces bombed Iraq heavily. Bridges, power plants, water systems, and even civilian areas were destroyed. The Iraqi army, though large, was no match for the advanced weapons of the coalition. By the end of February, Saddam's soldiers had been forced to retreat, and Kuwait was free. But while Saddam remained in power, Iraq itself was broken. The war destroyed much of the country's infrastructure. Electricity was unreliable, clean water was hard to find, and hospitals struggled to function without proper equipment. It was ordinary people, especially women and children, who paid the heaviest price. After the war, the United Nations imposed strict sanctions on Iraq. These sanctions were meant to punish Saddam and weaken his military. But in reality, they crushed everyday life. Food became scarce, medicine was nearly impossible to find. The most basic items, like baby formula, antibiotics, and clean drinking water, were suddenly out of reach for millions. Mothers were forced to watch their children suffer from hunger and preventable diseases. The suffering was immense. The United Nations later reported that in the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died because of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and lack of medicine. Behind each number was a grieving mother, often powerless to save her child. Women carried the weight of survival, standing in long lines for food rations, trading belongings for medicine, and struggling to keep their families alive in a country that was collapsing around them. But the worst was yet to come, because Saddam also had sons, Uday and Qusay, who were as brutal as their father. Both were raised in privilege, with unlimited power, but instead of using it to help the country, they used it to feed their own cruelty. For Iraqi women, their names alone brought fear. Uday, the older son, was the most feared. He was unpredictable, violent, and known for his obsession with women. He often sent his guards to pick out young girls from schools, universities, weddings, or even the streets of Baghdad. Many families never saw their daughters again once Uday's men took them to his palace. The stories that circulated were horrifying. Mothers warned their daughters not to walk alone, not to dress too nicely, and not to draw attention, because even being seen by Uday could be a death sentence for a girl's future. His cruelty did not stop there. Uday was notorious for targeting brides. In some cases, he would storm weddings with his men, kill or beat the groom, and take the bride for himself. Families lived in constant dread, knowing that a day meant for joy could turn into a nightmare if Uday heard about it. No one dared to resist him, because defying Saddam's son meant certain death. Qusay, the younger son, was quieter, but no less dangerous. Unlike Uday, who thrived on public displays of violence, Qusay worked in the shadows. He controlled Iraq's security services, including the Republican Guard and the intelligence agencies. This gave him absolute power over the prisons and detention centers, where thousands of Iraqis, including women, were held. Inside these prisons, women endured torture, humiliation, and sexual violence. Some were kept there as punishment for their husbands or brothers who opposed Saddam. Others were accused of crimes they never committed, simply to spread fear. Under Qusay's command, these abuses were not accidents. They were deliberate tools of control, designed to crush people's spirits and remind them that the regime owned every part of their lives. Together, Uday and Qusay created an environment where women felt trapped with no escape. Outside the home, Uday's men could take them at any moment. Inside the prisons, Qusay's system made sure that even those already broken could be pushed further into despair. It was a world where power meant women's safety could vanish in seconds, and no family, no matter how loyal, was truly safe. But Qusay's prisons were nothing compared to the other ones in Iraq. Abu Ghraib was the most notorious. Long before the world saw it under U.S. control in 2003, Iraqis already knew it was a symbol of terror. Women taken there often disappeared, and families rarely got answers about what had happened to them. Many of these women had committed no real crime. Some were jailed for whispering criticism of Saddam's rule, or for refusing to join the Ba'ath Party. Others were locked up only because their husbands, brothers, or sons had spoken out or fled the country. The regime punished women, not just for what they did, but for who they were connected to. Inside the cells, survival was almost impossible. Food was scarce, medical care was denied, and disease spread quickly. But the worst pain was deliberate. Former guards and survivors later described how sexual violence was turned into a tool of control. Women were not only raped, but their suffering was sometimes staged in front of family members to crush entire households. For men forced to watch, it was meant to destroy their dignity and silence any thought of resistance. When women were finally released, their ordeal did not end. In Iraqi society, rape carried a heavy stigma. Many survivors were rejected by their families or treated as if they were guilty rather than victims. Some chose never to speak of what happened, living in silence and isolation. Others were even killed by relatives who saw their honor as tainted. While prisons crushed women in the cities, another group of females, the Marsh Arabs, faced a different kind of suffering in the countryside. For centuries, the Marsh Arabs lived deep in the wetlands of southern Iraq. Their homes were built from reeds, their lives tied to fishing, farming, and water buffalo herding. Families passed down this way of life for generations, and women played a central role, caring for children, preparing food, and keeping their traditions alive. But after the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein saw the Marsh Arabs as enemies. He accused them of hiding rebels and helping uprisings against his rule. To punish them, his government drained the great marshes by building massive canals and dams. What was once one of the largest wetlands in the Middle East turned into dry, cracked land. Villages that had floated on water for centuries were left in ruins. With their homes gone and their animals dying, many women had no way to feed their children. Families were forced to walk for miles in search of food and water, often carrying babies in their arms while older children trailed behind. Diseases spread quickly, and medical care was almost impossible to find. Raids by soldiers added another layer of fear. Women were often the easiest targets. Some were beaten or assaulted during searches, while others watched their husbands and sons executed before their eyes. In some cases, entire families were forced to flee to Iran as refugees, leaving behind the land they had lived on for generations. For Marsh Arab women, the loss was more than physical. It was cultural. Traditions that had survived for 1,000 years were suddenly torn apart. Songs, crafts, and ways of living that had once been passed from mother to daughter were left in ruins, just like their homes. Saddam understood that true control did not come only from guns and soldiers. It came from fear inside people's homes. He used women as a way to punish and pressure entire families. If a man was accused of disloyalty, it was often his wife, sisters, or daughters who suffered. Sometimes they were arrested, sometimes they were harassed, and sometimes they were forced into situations that destroyed their lives. One cruel tactic was forcing women into marriages with men loyal to the regime. These marriages were not about love or choice. They were about control. By tying families to his loyalists, Saddam made sure no one dared to resist. Women who refused such arrangements faced threats of violence, imprisonment, or harm to their children. Even Saddam's so-called charities for widows and mothers were traps. On the surface, they looked like programs meant to help women who had lost husbands in war. In reality, they were designed to keep records, track movements, and watch families closely. Women who took aid from these groups were constantly monitored and lived in fear of saying the wrong thing. By the early 2000s, Saddam's rule was weakening. International sanctions had crushed Iraq's economy, and the world was pressuring him from all sides. But instead of loosening his grip, Saddam made life even harsher. He believed only terror could keep people in line. Public executions became common. Women accused of prostitution were dragged into the streets and beheaded by militias connected to Saddam's family. In many cases, these women were not prostitutes at all. They were ordinary women who had refused the advances of powerful men or who had spoken out against abuse. Their deaths were staged in public to scare everyone else into silence. But in March 2003, the US-led invasion crushed Saddam's hopes of more control. Coalition forces swept into Iraq, and within weeks, Saddam's regime collapsed. His palaces were stormed, his statues toppled, and his portraits torn down across the country. On the streets, some Iraqis celebrated the end of his rule, while others stood in shock, unsure of what the future would bring. For women, Saddam's fall was a moment of mixed emotions. His direct rule of terror was finally over. No more fear of his soldiers bursting through the door in the night. But the chaos that followed brought new dangers. Without order, gangs and militias filled the vacuum. Extremist groups began rising, and kidnappings of women increased. Many who had hoped for freedom found themselves facing new threats, this time from lawlessness rather than the state. On December 13, 2003, U.S. soldiers finally found Saddam hiding in a small underground hole near his hometown of Tikrit. The once powerful dictator who had terrified millions was pulled from the dirt with no army around him. Across Iraq, people celebrated, and many women hoped this was the beginning of justice for the pain they had carried in silence. When Saddam went on trial, he was charged with crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. The court found him guilty, and on December 30th, 2006, he was executed by hanging. For many Iraqis, this was the end of an era of fear. But for women, the scars he left behind did not disappear with his death. They had lived through wars, prisons, executions, and daily terror. His execution closed one chapter, but the pain and trauma remained in their lives, passed on even to the next generation.